Last month, we had a quick look at some of the mechanical features of the 1961 models, but we didn't have time to discuss a few of the new servicing procedures.
That's right, Pat. What's on tap for tonight?
If you want a suggestion, Pat, I'd like to have you start with the instrument cluster. I found more fellas who seem to be afraid to do any work on instruments.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Tech. I'll start there then, because it isn't anything they should be afraid of. Maybe I can take some of the mystery out of instrument service.
I'd like that, Pat. I feel like the rest of the guys when it comes to working around the instrument panel.
Well, you'll notice the instruments in these new 61 models are grouped together in a basic assembly called the instrument cluster. Therefore, it'll be easier to locate trouble in the gauge circuits.
It's beginning to sound good, Pat. I'm all for any job that can be done easier.
On this Plymouth and on Chrysler models, you can test and replace gauges without removing the cluster. On all other models, you must remove the cluster from the instrument panel to test or replace the gauges.
I'm listening, Pat. What's the story?
Well, it looks like I'm getting ahead of myself, Jim. Maybe I'd better tell you about the new gauge testing procedure.
Yeah, that does seem like a smart idea.
Here's the new thermal type gauge tester for testing the oil pressure gauge, the engine temperature gauge, and the fuel gauge. It will also test the oil pressure warning light on those cars that use it.
What about the generator warning light?
No more generator warning lights, Jim. All U.S.-built 61 models have an alternator and use an ammeter. Canadian-built cars have a generator, but they also use an ammeter. And, of course, you test the ammeter with the regular volts-ampere tester. When testing the other instruments, the first unit to check is the sending unit. This new tester makes that a pretty simple operation. Now, for example, let's test the engine temperature gauge sending unit on this car. Disconnect the wire from the sending unit, connect one lead from the tester to that wire, connect the other lead to a good ground. This takes the sending unit out of the circuit.
I see. The tester takes the place of the sending unit.
That's right. Set the pointer of the tester on L. Now turn the ignition key on, and the temperature gauge needle should be pointing to C for cold, plus or minus about 1/8 of an inch.
Right on the button, Pat.
Good. Next, I'll turn the gauge tester pointer to M, and the temperature gauge needle should move up to the middle of the scale.
If you're wondering why the needle moves so slowly, it's because the gauge needs a few seconds to warm up.
Needle is about in the center, I'd say.
All right. Finally, I'll turn the gauge tester pointer to H. The instrument panel gauge should move to H, or the hot end of the scale.
That's where it is, Pat. So that means this temperature gauge is okay throughout its entire range.
And that's what it does, Jim. Now, in a case where the gauge had not registered properly when the car came in, but did register properly when the tester was substituted for the sending unit, what would that mean to you?
Why, that the sending unit was at fault.
Right you are, Jim. But suppose the gauge didn't register correctly when the tester was being used. What then?
Why, I would assume that the sending unit was okay and that the gauge itself was at fault.
Either the gauge or the wire from the sending unit to the gauge, Jim. Don't overlook wiring troubles.
Gee, that's right. I should have thought about that. But then I would test at the gauge next. If it tested okay, I'd know I had trouble in the sending unit wire.
Right you are. Pat, why not run through the testing procedures of the other sending units so Jim will get some practice using this new tester?
Yeah, that's a good idea, Tech. Let's see what you can do with it, Jim.
Well, the hookup at the oil pressure sending unit would be the same as for the temperature gauge sending unit. But since this car has a warning light, couldn't I just remove the wire from the sending unit and ground it to test the warning light?
Yes, you could. But when you use the tester, it will also show up trouble in the wiring. There should be no light with the tester pointer at L, a glow with a tester in the M position, and a bright light with a tester in the H position. Now, a dim light at H would mean resistance in the wiring.
When you test the fuel tank sending unit by taking it out of the circuit, remove the lead wire from the snap terminal at the unit.
Then you'd go through the same testing procedure. If you suspect trouble in the sending unit, be sure it has a good ground.
Okay, Tech, I'll remember that. Boy, I sure like this tester. It takes all the guesswork out of finding which unit is at fault, and it's so easy to use.
It sure is. That's one tester every dealer should have.
Yeah, that's for sure. This one belongs to Tech, but I have one on order. Well, that brings us up to the next point, which is testing the gauges in the panel.
Don't forget about the voltage supply to the gauges.
Oh, I'm just coming to that, Tech. This is another point that Jim has to remember. This is a 12-volt electrical system, as you know, but if you test the gauges with 12 volts directly from the battery, you'll burn them out. That's because they operate on regulated voltage. That is, controlled through a special voltage regulator. Now, this ensures uniform gauge registration. The special regulator has a set of vibrating contacts that regulate the voltage. There's no adjustment provided, and it's serviced as a complete unit.
While we're talking about this voltage regulator, better tell Jim that it may be positioned externally or internally, Pat.
Yeah, that's right, Tech. You'll find this externally mounted regulator is used on Plymouth and Lancer models, Jim, and I'll cover the internally mounted units later. The 12-volt lead-in is connected to one of the double-blade terminals marked IGN. The other blade carries the condenser pigtail. The single-blade terminal is for the wires which carry the regulated voltage to the various gauges.
I see. But why the condenser?
The vibrating points may set up a noise in the radio, Jim, and the condenser is used to kill it.
Gee, that's right. They would, wouldn't they? I never thought of that.
Well, that brings us back to the operation of testing the gauge in the cluster to prove whether the circuit or the gauge itself could be at fault. So we'll start with the temperature gauge. Reach up behind the instrument cluster and disconnect the purple wire from the terminal on the temperature gauge. Now, this is the wire from the sending unit. Then connect one lead of the tester to the gauge terminal from which the wire was just removed, and connect the other tester lead to a good ground. Then, with the ignition turned on, turn the tester pointer first to L, then to M, and then to H. The gauge should read in succession from the low end to the middle and then to the high end of the scale.
Works perfectly, Pat. Looks like our trouble is in the sending unit wire.
Yeah, but what if the gauge didn't register properly?
Well, in that case, the fault could be in one or more of three places. It could be in the regulator, the wire from the regulator to the gauge, or the gauge. You'd find the fault by a process of elimination.
If we know the other gauges work all right, then we know the regulator is okay.
Yeah, that's right, Tech. To test the wire, connect a jumper between the regulator's single-blade terminal and the gauge to be sure there's a good wiring connection to the gauge. And then, if the gauge didn't work, it must be the gauge that's at fault.
Something else is going to be at fault if you don't turn this record over.
But if the gauge doesn't work, the trouble could be in the wire from the sending unit, the regulator, the wire between the regulator and the gauge, or the gauge, right?
We eliminate the regulator by observing the other gauges and eliminate the wiring by using a jumper. And if the gauge still didn't work properly, you'd know it was at fault. You can replace it from behind the panel without removing the cluster.
Before you start removing any gauge, always, and I do mean always, disconnect the battery negative ground cable. If you don't, you're almost sure to cause a short somewhere and burn out a gauge. I mean, even a guy like you can make a mistake once in a while.
You're not kidding, Tech. I've made my share of mistakes, and a lot of them could have been prevented by simply disconnecting a battery cable. I won't forget to do that, you can be sure. Gee, there seems to be plenty of room back here to remove this temperature gauge with this short screwdriver. Have the job done in a jiffy.
Now, if you were testing the fuel gauge, you would disconnect the blue lead-in from the terminal on the gauge and test it in the same manner.
So that just about covers the use of the gauge tester and how to test the various gauges and their circuits.
This testing procedure sure takes the guesswork out of gauge testing. I'm all for it.
Now, before we leave this Plymouth, I'll show you how to get to the light bulbs for the ammeter, oil pressure indicator, turn signal indicator, headlight beam indicator, and the speedometer.
Looks like that'll come in handy, Pat.
First, take out those 4 screws along the upper edge of the speedometer base that hold the speedometer cover to the base. You'll need an offset Phillips screwdriver to get at them. Then, lift the cover slightly and slide it toward the windshield to release the two clips from the base. Then lift it off. The indicator bulbs and sockets should then be separated from the cluster to test or replace them.
Well, that looks easy enough. Say, what's the dope on removing the speedometer?
Well, first, you take out the screws that hold the speedometer bezel in place and remove the bezel. Next, remove the 4 speedometer to base attaching screws and raise the speedometer head, being careful not to damage the cable. Then, disconnect the cable from the head.
Jim, there's one point I want to emphasize when you put the speedometer back. Be careful you don't kink the cable, or it'll set up a noise.
Yeah, that's a real good point, Tech. Well, that just about covers the story on servicing instruments on the Plymouth models. You know, Jim, I think we ought to go through the procedures of removing the cluster before testing the gauges, like you have to do on some models.
Sounds good, Pat. I was just wondering when you were going to give out with that.
Well, right now, Tech. We can use this dart because it's representative of most other models on which the cluster has to be removed.
What about this steering wheel? Won't it be in the way?
Well, actually, it won't, Jim. You don't have to remove the steering wheel on Dart, Polara, DeSoto, and Imperial models in order to remove the instrument cluster. But because it'll be more convenient for you on this practice run, I'd suggest you remove it. So, suppose you get started. Pull the steering wheel while I turn out the showroom lights, and then I'll give you a hand.
Will do. I'll have this wheel off by the time you get back, Pat.
All ready? You better cover that steering column with masking tape or soft cloth so you won't scratch it.
That's a lot easier than having to repaint it, Jim.
Now, remember what I said earlier about disconnecting the battery ground cable before you remove any instruments? Well, now's the time to do it.
I'll get at it right away, Pat. Now, where do I start?
On the front face, from the underside of the cluster, remove these 2 rows of 4 screws each. Next, reach up under the panel and bend back the wiring harness retaining clips to give the harness greater flexibility. Then, tilt the instrument cluster down and disengage the overlap at the center of the cluster. Carefully pull the cluster out of the panel and rest it on the protected steering column.
If you have any trouble removing that cluster, there's a tip in the reference book on how to do it.
Okay. Say, where's the voltage regulator on this cluster?
On Dart, Polara, and DeSoto models, the regulator is built into the fuel gauge. You'll notice the gauge has 3 terminals. The connection for the condenser is a pigtail which comes out of the I terminal lead. The terminal marked with the letter I is for the 12-volt lead-in wire. Terminal A carries the connections to the other gauges for the regulated voltage. Terminal S is for the lead to the sending unit of that gauge.
Are we ready to start the tests now, Pat?
Yes, but you better connect that battery ground cable so we'll have some current to the cluster.
Oh, thanks, Pat. I almost forgot that.
And something else, buddy boy. You better ground that instrument cluster to the panel with a jumper wire or you'll burn out the gauges.
Boy, I sure won't forget that.
From here, you'd test either the fuel or temperature gauges or the oil pressure indicator in the same manner as you tested the Plymouth gauges.
See if I do this right. I'll remove the wire from the sending unit terminal of this fuel gauge, disconnecting the sending unit. Then, I'll connect one tester lead to that terminal and the other lead to ground. And I'll turn the ignition on. If the gauge doesn't register properly, I'll replace it.
Now, here's a thought I'd like to inject before you condemn any one gauge. This is true, particularly in the case of gauges that have the built-in regulators. If you tested all 3 gauges and none of them registered properly, it could be that the voltage regulator is at fault. In that case, only the gauge that has the built-in regulator would have to be replaced.
If you have to replace a gauge on Dart, Polara, DeSoto, Lancer, Valiant, or Imperial models, disconnect the wiring from all the gauges and pull the lamp bulb sockets from the cluster. Then, take the cluster to the bench. Place it on a pad to guard against scratching it before you remove the gauge.
Thanks, Tech. I'll remember that.
There's a lot more information on how to service the instrument clusters on other models. You'll find it in the reference book, but we can hit some of the highlights now.
Good. I'd like that.
Well, as far as speedometers are concerned, You know we don't service them. That's most generally done by the local speedometer service dealer. But we've got to know how to remove and install them.
How do you remove them?
On Dart, Polara, DeSoto, and Chrysler models, you can remove the cluster without disturbing the speedometer. However, you do have to remove the cluster in order to remove the speedometer.
Tell them what's different about Chrysler and Imperial speedometers, Pat.
Oh, I'm right with you, Tech. There's a different story there, Jim, due to the use of panelescent lighting. On Chrysler models, the instrument cluster, which is the plastic dome with the instrument base, can be removed separately from the speedometer. The housing that contains the speedometer is removed after the instrument cluster has been removed and should not be taken apart.
Okay, Pat, I'll remember that.
In the Imperial, however, the speedometer comes out with the gauge cluster. The gauges can be removed individually, but the speedometer should not be removed from the housing. The housing contains the panelescent lamps.
What's so special about those panelescent lamps?
Just this, Jim. Special assembly fixtures are required to install the lamps in their housing. And since we don't have the fixtures, we'll keep our hands off them. The speedometer dealer is equipped to handle this service.
Well, Jim, I hope these few tips that Tech and I have given you, and what you'll find in this reference book, will make the job of servicing instrument panels easier.
Well, there's no question about that, Pat.
Just do a good job and keep the customers happy. That way, we'll all be sure to eat regularly. Well, so long, fellas. Be seeing you next month.